Born again. My life began 3.5 years ago. I woke up sloughing down a road, holding my arm. I didn't have a single, solitary memory from before I was found, and as much as I've tried, none of it has ever come back to me, not even the parts I know to be true. No specific events or facts, anyway, with the exception of 2 narrow categories. I used to have an exact count of days from the date they found me, but I lost track. If you think you wouldn't have, I challenge you to say exactly how many days you've been alive. As I stumbled along, looking drunk but really just so thirsty I could hardly think, a cop car pulled up slightly in front of me, and the officers got out to question me. When they couldn't get anything coherent and no identification, they got an ambulance. It turned out my arm was broken. They assumed I had been hit by a car, but the evidence pointed in confusing directions. I didn't test for any drugs or alcohol, and I didn't have any signs of a concussion. They MRI'd me and couldn't find any bleeding or anything else amiss. When they really thought about my injuries, they realized they were all on the arms. Aside from the break, my wrists and forearms had road burn, which suggested that I had been thrown forwards through the air with my hands out. That told them I might have been on a bike and either went over the handlebars or get hit by a car and then went over. The force that I must have landed with made them lean toward my having been hit from behind. But when they went back there, morning drive, they couldn't find a bike anywhere. My riding a bike was a little strange anyway because I was dressed in an old pair of jeans, a button-down plaid shirt, a canvas jacket, boots, and a baseball cap. If I were riding a bike in those clothes, it suggested I was off the road because of a DUI. But there were no DUIs in the whole region that matched my description. So they didn't have any real evidence pointing to any specific thing. Strangely, that caused them to think the worst of me. They clung to the concept of a DUI, I guess because it was the only thing that made even theoretical sense. It was hard to blame them, but still, it kicked off a whole long list of assumptions about my character that I still don't forgive them for. I'll admit, they did their best to find a perpetrator, but they didn't have much to go on. If they had found a bike, they'd be able to use the paint color to try to match it with scratches on cars that came in for repairs. But that would have been a long shot anyway, and there was no guarantee someone would even bother fixing the car, or that they would have done it near Bakersfield. As for the bike, anyone could have taken it, and there was no description of it. It was a news story, but even if someone saw it, they might not act on that information for a whole list of reasons. My case went into the great temporary filed folder of unaccountable things. Slapped together and set free, but not that free. So the doctors patched me up and tried to get me better. Their only concern was the amnesia. But the cops, they couldn't leave it alone. Perhaps they were the type who can't go to bed until they've finished that puzzle and can't stand having a piece missing at the end. I didn't make sense, which made my case a problem, which eventually made me a problem. For the time being, they slotted me under drunk on side of road, possible feigned amnesia, potential drug impairment. Even though I was not faking anything and they'd already proved I wasn't drunk and didn't have a drug problem. For some people, any explanation is better than no explanation. Detective Brown was one such person. Even after his colleagues were ready to let it fade into oblivion, he kept after it, as you'll see. The hospital kept me for a few days, hoping I would start remembering. A word which, in the minds of the detectives, had become confessing. They were there every day to ask the same questions. If only my present lawyer had been there at the time, he would have told me to just shut up, and that would have saved me a lot of grief. I also had to talk to various specialists and psychiatrists. Lots of tests, lots of questions, all to no avail. Finally, they let me out of the hospital, but put me in a psychiatric institution for a few weeks. Having this on my record turned out to be very bad for obtaining a license. Thank you, Bakersfield. I suppose they meant well. It wouldn't make sense to just let me go after 3 or 4 days if I was that confused. But I hated that place, especially the smell. Nurse Aubrey was nice. She was the one who believed in me at that time, and she listened without always trying to get me to remember things. Friends and frenemies. The others were vicious. Believe me when I say that psychiatrists are just freaks with their own mental problems, which is why they're interested in psychology, and once they start slotting you, good luck digging yourself out. Everything you do or say can be used to support some diagnosis or other, including, and most frustratingly, statements like, "I feel okay." Imagine saying you feel okay and having people say you're not. And the fact that you say you're okay is just more evidence that you're not capable of assessing your own state of being. And if you show any frustration over that, boy, then you're really in trouble. All they figured out was that I was pretty good with numbers. I didn't like to read. I had above average spatial abilities. I was knowledgeable of 70s rock, liked horror movies, and could play the trumpet although my embouchure was shot. There were a few other talents, deficits, and quirks that they found, but nothing that provided any answers or usable clues. And the police stayed on it and stayed on it and stayed on it. That one guy, Detective Brown, just couldn't get his head around the idea that a person could be right there in front of his face with no further evidence of his existence. I told him once that paperwork doesn't prove I exist any better than the fact that I'm right there, and I don't like him spitting crumbs in my face when he talks. And he didn't take it well. He wasn't acting out of the goodness of his heart. No. He was convinced I was hiding something, that I must owe child support or have a warrant or be running away from some recent crime that hadn't been discovered yet. He didn't want getting out of that to be so easy as saying, and he told me this exact thing once, he didn't want it to be so easy as, I forget who I was. I reminded him that I had broken my arm and had other injuries. How could I fake those? And I didn't just walk in town and say, "Gee, I don't know who I am. Can you give me free housing and health care?" That didn't go over well with him either. Perhaps I could have been nicer about it, but the real issue was that he didn't like being wrong, and his response to being contradicted was to double the torture. He was after me every week asking the same questions, backwards and forwards, looking for some inconsistency. I can take some pleasure in the fact that he never did figure out who I was. On the bright side, I'll give it to him and the police generally that they were helpful in ruling out possibilities for who I could have been. As far as they could tell, I didn't live anywhere near California. There were no missing persons cases matching my description nationwide that they could find. There was no fingerprint or DNA record that could be matched. There were no warrants matching my description. And there were no deceased people I could have been mistaken for. They did make progress. Answers? With Aubrey's help, one of my real doctors, I called the hospital doctors my real doctors, not the ones at the loony bin, Dr. Forrester, a tediously methodical but perceptive man, concluded that I must have been in a fugue, a condition where a person simply goes into an extended dreamlike state where they have no knowledge of their past. They just fade off into another existence and somehow get along okay. It comes from the Latin word for fleeing, but it doesn't mean you have fled your previous life per se, just that you are gone from it. Normally, Fugue patients return home by themselves and remember everything about themselves. But paradoxically, for the most part, they have no memory of the time they were in the fugue. It could come from some psychological trauma, but not always. Technically, I was still in a fugue because I couldn't remember my previous life. So he called it fugue with amnesia. Dr. Forrester said that was unusual, but on the other hand, there was no average or normal fugue. Sometimes reminders of the past could bring someone out of it, but since they could find no trace of me, that wasn't possible. The only way I was going to come back to my real self, barring some relative finding me, was for me to spontaneously start remembering things. Until then, he thought I should move on with life. I had no mental handicap, so there was nothing stopping me from getting a job. Well, other than my social security number. He said the chances of going back into a fugue were very low, although he suggested I carry a letter in a plastic bag explaining my situation and listing a few contact people. And he thought that time may bring it all back. My question was, if I went into another fugue, how could I know? And he said I couldn't. He had a theory that if I learned how to dream lucidly, I might be able to control it. But he made it clear that was based on nothing whatsoever. It was just a hypothesis. As far as the authorities' relationship to me, that was about it, except that Detective Brown suggested I stick around. This I did, but not because he wanted me to. I had few options. I'd gotten a small sum from a charity organized by none other than Aubrey, which got me started, but wasn't enough for more than a tent, which I set up near the Kern River just outside town. That was stealth camping, but the people at the Living Museum just east of my spot knew about me and didn't complain. They actually gave me rides into town and helped me with a gym membership so I could shower. I was able to find jobs and stay alive. I had no interest in drugs, thank goodness. I enjoyed a little whiskey here and there, especially if there was no work, but that's it. I did a good job for people, mostly mowing lawns and other odd jobs, and I had a knack for fixing appliances and doing carpentry. I could hang any door, and if that doesn't sound like much, you've never tried to hang one in a leaning trapezoid. Aubrey got me a cell phone so people could text me, and sometimes people would just drive up and ask if I could help with something. It was a workable situation for the time being, but obviously it wasn't something that could last forever. Identification. Where the authorities really left me twisting in the wind was getting a social security card. This was sort of the linchpin to everything else, and I can tell you, the Social Security Administration is tighter than a frozen witch when it comes to issuing a new card. You need proof of who you are for that, and since that SSN is kind of proof for everything, you're stuck. The conversation was always the same. You could get a birth certificate. Sure, but not if you don't know who you are. Is there anyone who can vouch for your identity? No, that's the whole point of this conversation. You'll need to apply for, etc. It just went in circles. And all this when, let's face it, I'm white, I speak English, and obviously I'm from here. And there I am watching illegal immigrants come through with a hand wave and get an ITIN, an individual taxpayer identification number, no problem. But anyway, for me, no SSN, no real job. No real job, no real income. I was bound to have trouble with the IRS eventually. Just a huge problem that was a lot more complicated than I'm even telling you. And much as I wanted out of Bakersfield, I had to stay because at least the police knew who I was. The last thing I wanted was to be in another town with zero ID or actual identity and have another extended run-in with the police. Add to that the fact that I was always a little worried I would go into another fugue and all this effort would just blow away like a puff of smoke all over again. And to tell the truth, I wasn't so sure I wanted to know who I had been. Identity. Believe it or not, especially looking back now, that time as a homeless tent guy was really the highlight of my stay in my new world. I finally submitted to fate and just got by day. It was as close to a pure state of being as I could imagine. I wasn't an identity according to society, just a being. I worried neither about the past nor the future. In that sense, it was the ideal everyone strives for, the Zen-like mountain dweller existence everybody says they want, after making those millions and sending the kids through college. That made me think of that book, The Green Door by H.G. Wells, which is about someone who keeps seeing this green door that leads to eternal bliss, and all he has to do is go through it to be happy forever. But he keeps putting it off because there's always something important he has to do, and so finally he loses the opportunity. Mentioning that to Dr. Forrester, whom I still met sometimes pro bono, surprised him. He'd been told I didn't like books. Turns out it's a short story, though, so maybe it was something someone told me about and I never did read it. But there it was, a memory from before. One that was hard to characterize, but was the first of the two great categories of memories I came away with. It wasn't anything specific the way an event is, but it was a recollection of imaginary events. At the same time, it didn't count as something like knowing how to ride a bike or fix a refrigerator. It was in between something that had happened and something that I had learned. Dr. Forrester still asked me things like what day or year it was to see how my memory was. I never knew, but not because I was incapable. I didn't think it mattered if at any time I could go into another fugue and fast forward a few years. I thought of days as pieces of paper that you stick on a nail on the side of a barn and forget, and then rain would soften them up and wash them away. He understood, however, unlike what the Sykes would have done. They would have been concerned and brought me back to the ward for observation. He knew that time for me had become an abstraction, and he didn't think my apathy was depressive, but just realistic. All I could do was wait for the Social Security Administration and see if my memory returned. I wondered if my fugue state was really just extreme apathy. Perhaps I didn't have a break, but rather just stopped caring about the details and faded away from life. Right now, this second, as I write this, I think of Bartleby, who just resigned from existence. And there it is again. Another book I don't ever remember reading. A real clue. It was around this time, several months after my reawakening, that Aubrey got the first ragged clue as to who I was. Bakersfield isn't the biggest city in California, but it isn't the smallest either, and Kern River Park wasn't the only park in the area. Why, she reasoned, had I gravitated toward this one in particular? I thought it was because it was the obvious place to go. Off the beaten track, not many people. But she thought maybe it was because I had lived there before. Whenever she went shopping or went out of town, she would stop at homeless camps and ask about me. That was time-consuming and, I thought, dangerous. But she was the kind of person who always had to help, and she always had trust. I guess that's why she was a nurse. And she finally struck gold. She visited one camp 3 times, and on the 3rd visit, someone claimed to recognize me. She brought me over there, and I didn't recognize him, but the guy swore he'd seen me at Kern River a year or 2 before. Aubrey and I could see he was not exactly a reliable witness, but it was a strand of something. Aubrey, out of pity for me and an increasing impatience with the authorities, especially the SSA, decided to take up my case more seriously. She started working her way through missing persons databases and other online resources. Detective Brown and his goons had already supposedly tried all that, but she didn't trust them. She convinced me to move into her shed out back. Her husband had died a few years before, and she still had 2 high school-age daughters at home. So for the sake of appearances, she didn't want me in the house. The shed was full of tools she hardly used, so she put the lawnmower and stuff like that in the garage and sold off things like the table saw. And I had a place I could call home. It wasn't the Taj Mahal, but it felt nice to have 4 walls and an actual door. I was moved by her trust in me. Since the shed had no plumbing, I showered, cleaned my clothes, and ate in her house. And to allow that, with 2 daughters, was really putting herself out for me. She was more interested in solving the mystery of me than I was, but I would go in and use the computer to try to track myself down too. That led me to find out I was a good touch typist, and I knew my way around internet research, at least better than looking at the first page of Google results. I didn't get very far, but the irony of using Google made me laugh. Everyone else in the world complained about how Google knew everything about you, down to the rank order of your favorite childhood TV shows. But I couldn't get it to tell me anything about me if I took it by the throat and strangled it. Fake but comfortable. Meanwhile, I got more and more comfortable with my position in life. Most people will look back at where they were 10 years prior and say they are better off for what has happened. This counts even for people who've had calamity befall them, bankruptcy, divorce, illness, and I suppose I was no different. I was in the special position of having no one to refer back to, but I felt better off. I felt it in my bones. And logically, my previous life couldn't have been that great. If I'd been rich or famous, someone would have found me by now. Leonardo DiCaprio doesn't go into a fugue and then have to spend 6 months putting 2 and 2 together again. What's more, I felt that Aubrey and I were getting closer. I had been somewhat infatuated with her from the beginning, and I built up an emotional debt to her that I wanted to repay. She was the only one on my side, and I had a good feeling about us. Yes, I was in the garden shed, which would normally be where a bad husband might be sent, or where a good husband would go to escape a bad wife. But my trajectory was toward her, not away. Her daughters, too, had a genuine charity in their hearts, and they treated me kindly, not just because I was a waif, but because their kindness came from the inside out. I felt welcome around them. I even felt hopeful that the SSA would finally give me a number. Imagine wanting to be a number. And I could finally be a man with an official name. I even had a name I wanted to take on, George Wilcox. It came to me as I tried to go to sleep one night in the shed. I hadn't thought about it. It just appeared in my mind and sounded right. Of course, we all wondered if it had been my real name or like my real name. Long story short, it wasn't. But I liked the idea of having something more personal than John Doe, which the police had literally been calling me since my arrival. Others avoided doing that, but it was awkward to work around the gap formed in a conversation where you can't say the other person's name. Hey, you will keep you at a distance, no matter how well you know someone. George Wilcox suited them fine, and you know what? Their demeanor around me changed. Aubrey spent a good deal of time trying to find any connection to that name. The only halfway prominent person with it was a long-dead politician in Hawaii. But she contacted many George Wilcoxes, as many as she could find on Facebook or otherwise, and found no hits. How great would it have been to find my face next to an untouched George Wilcox account? But something so simple was not to be. So I was starting to think that I would get that card pretty soon, and with it, a clean start with a job, a license, and the rest of the backpack full of things you need to be a person in America. and then I would be all right. Trying to dig up the past started to seem like a waste of time. And then it happened.